Well, do you want to start, Alex? I guess then with your background, because I think I'm right in saying that obviously you've suffered with chronic fatigue syndrome yourself, so you've got a unique stance on having experienced this condition, um, and then maybe how that sort of brought you into the Optimum Health Clinic, which you now run as well.
Sure. So I had ME/CFS for 7 years as a teenager. So started when I was just before I turned 16, and up until that point, I would like to say I had a relatively normal childhood, but I'm not sure what a normal childhood actually is. In some ways, it wasn't very normal. But I'd had some previous issues with IBS and kind of digestive problems and that sort of thing. But basically, I was a relatively kind of healthy kind of teenager up until that point. And so it was pretty much as sudden as I woke up one morning. I'd been out uh, drinking, underage drinking, as you do with my then girlfriend and some friends the night before. Woke up and I just thought I was hungover, and I never had a hangover before, so I didn't really have much context. But after a few days of this, I was like, oh, I'm not sure there's a hangover. What else going on here? And initially, I was diagnosed as having a virus, and then it was a kind of post-viral virus. And then I think about 3 or 4 months passed, and after numerous trips back to the to my GP, my grandmother actually said, "Do you think it could be ME chronic fatigue?" And I had no real context to that. I had a teacher at my primary school who I think I kind of knew had ME chronic fatigue, and like she didn't do the PE lessons and a few things, but I didn't really have much. I just knew it wasn't necessarily good news, and that basically catalyzed the next couple of years of being extremely desperate. I mean, my symptoms were fairly extreme fatigue. So sometimes I could do a few hours school a day. Other times I couldn't leave the house for kind of weeks on end. Headaches, muscle aches, dizziness, extreme fatigue, but not often able to sleep, which was a very kind of frustrating kind of
Okay.
part of it. And after a couple of years of this, getting desperately behind in school, not really seeing friends. And when you're a teenager, especially a teenage boy, it's like your friendships are based on what you can do. And if you can't do stuff, basically you don't have friends. That was kind of the experience. So I reached a point after a couple of years where it wasn't that I wanted to end my life. I couldn't face continuing living my life the way that it was. I mean, it was just basically hell on earth. And I had a conversation with my uncle, which was a little bit. It was a little bit like if you've seen Lord of the Rings, but like Gandalf in Lord of the Rings. Like he wasn't there very much, but he would just turn up at the right moment, and then disappear off into the horizon for another period of time. But it's cutting a long story short. But he basically helped me understand that if I wanted the circumstances of my life to change, then I was going to have to change it. And I didn't have medical background. I didn't have psychology background. I just was really, really desperate, and I had time. And I then spent the next 5 years, again, it's a whole long story, but spent the next 5 years increasingly obsessively researching health and psychology and practicing meditation and yoga and really doing everything I could to turn around the situation I was in. And some things worked, some things didn't work. I think at one point I had the most expensive poo in South Wales where I was at university. I was taking 60 supplements a day and I probably couldn't afford any of them. But I just tried everything I could. And on the other side of that, I made a full recovery. I wrote a book about it. And I then basically went on to set up the organization that I'd wanted to exist in the years that I'd been ill.
Okay. And it must have been at a time when, social media and things were pretty much not going to exist. So it must have been an even harder experience in regards to trying to get the knowledge around what you needed to do. Because I find it fascinating how things were sort of pre-Facebook, Instagram, because now there's such freely accessible information out there. But I think it's also a very common story, obviously. Doing what I do, I've supported a few teenagers with a similar story. And as you say, I think especially in that age group where I like your point around, friendships are based around what you can do, because it's very true. I think I look back to 17, 18 And it is essentially going out, staying up late, drinking a bit too much, and that was where bonds were formed ultimately.
It's funny actually, just to pick up on your point around pre-social media. Um, I literally had to go to the local library and
Wow.
look on a database of books that they had or that they could order. And I think there was a computer at the library I went to, but it was literally like the black screen with the green kind of stuff on it. I mean, it was really like it was we're talking 1996, I guess.
Okay.
And so that was extremely difficult, and I would if you wanted to buy a book, you had to go to a bookstore and you had to order it for a bookstore, and then it would take like weeks to come, and then you had to kind of you get a phone call and you had to go and collect it. So it was difficult. I was just trying to get access to information, and there weren't, I wanted to find inspirational stories of people that had been through ME, chronic fatigue, and recovered, because I could see that all I was hearing was the negativity of, well, actually two polarized perspectives. One perspective, there's nothing wrong with you, basically get on with your life. And the other perspective, you've got this severe chronic illness there's no answer for, and you're going to spend the rest of your life suffering from it. Ironically, both messages from different medical experts, and that was always somewhat frustrating. Like, can you figure out which one of you guys is right? Because they're somewhat contradictory perspectives. But wanting to kind of to have inspirational stories, and I instinctively stayed away from support groups because I wasn't really interested in, and in hindsight, actually, I would hold a different perspective on this. But at the time, I didn't have interest in having support in being ill. I wanted to understand how to recover, but I literally couldn't find. There was one book, a lady called Erica White, who was a nutritional therapist, who was the kind of first wave of nutritional therapy for ME/CFS looking at Candida, and that became a whole big thing, and loads of us in those days ended up on these crazy anti-Candida diets and following all kinds of antifungals and things. But it was really the only book that I came across of someone that had ME, chronic fatigue, and recovered. So I was reading books by people that had cancer or had HIV or had been paralyzed, that had dealt with great life adversity to recover, because that was really the only inspirational information that was there. And then I would get a hold of kind of audio programs, and I would just listen to them 2-3 hours a day lying on my bed, just trying to find information. So at least these days you can go online and you've got the opposite problem. You're almost just inundated with too much information, and it's hard to wade through to figure out what's actually going to be useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And in regards to your improvement and progress, do you feel that there was a particular thing you found that was the real key piece of the puzzle, or was it sort of over a few years you just progressively improved?
There was no one thing that I did that felt it improved things more than it improved things more than 5 or 10% in an immediately obvious way.
Okay.
So I would say there were things that over time I could see clearly had an impact, and when I stopped doing them, I could really see the impact of the difference between doing that activity or not doing that activity. But there wasn't really one supplement or one protocol or one practice that it was like I did it and like that was it, like there was a massive turning point. And that was in many ways very frustrating, and it made it quite hard sometimes to stay consistent and stay motivated with things. But there were things along the way that clearly were helping and clearly were kind of paving the way. And they were certainly, in time when I ended up setting up the Optimum Health Clinic, they were the beginnings of the kind of threads that I started to follow more. And then, of course, what I realized was what works for one person completely doesn't work for another person. And I'm somewhat allergic these days to people that have done a particular path. That's the thing that's helped them. And then they want to kind of convert the world to that thing, which was the thing. And because I just, with Optimum Health Clinic, having treated literally thousands of patients in 40 countries around the world, one of the things that I've learned over the years in many ways is how little we know despite how much we know, because you just recognize that, yes, there are patterns and there are consistencies and there are certain building blocks that will have significant benefit for the majority of people, but there are no two recovery journeys that are exactly the same. And I think it was helpful. It helped shaping me as a practitioner. The fact that my own journey was a tricky journey and it didn't have miracle breakthroughs, because I think I came out of that with a sensitivity towards the variance of different people's experiences, and what works for one person can literally be the worst possible thing for another person. And you see that particularly with nutrition protocols, that there are people which will swear that going raw food, for example, had a massive impact, and others, they will literally destroy their adrenals in the process. And there's just so much variety in people's experience.
Yeah, it's a really key point, I think, because I actually would love to go back and expand on what you mentioned around the support groups and social media, and how I think you said your perception has changed around that. Because obviously it happens at the level of the researchers, whereby some are convinced it's viral, some are convinced it's microbial or related to the gut microbiome. You've got the nutritionists who some think it's keto, some go paleo, vegetarian. And then obviously the same is true, I find, from a general public perspective. So as you say, what works for one, as a result, they think that is the answer for people who also have their condition. Mm-hmm. So is there anything you want to or can just expand on that's helped change your perspective on these support groups?
Yeah, well, I'm just going to speak to what you said just now first, and I'll come back to that. Sure. So just a little story. When I first started the Optimum Health Clinic, during my recovery path, I did a lot of research and learning around both psychology and nutrition, but I did a degree in psychology at the later stages of recovery, and then a lot of extra training, and that became kind of my focus. But I still maintained this kind of interest on the nutrition side. So when I launched the Optimum Health Clinic, I was clear that I wanted to have the psychology branch, but I also wanted to have nutrition branch. And I found myself in an intimate relationship for a period of time with Nikki Grashrix, who was the founding director of nutrition. Oh. And so she then she kind of shared my somewhat maverick attitude to kind of therapy in the world, and was just like, let's just figure out stuff by doing it, and let's just respond to every patient. And we were completely crazy and obsessive in those days about the amount of time. We'd be up literally talking 2 o'clock in the morning discussing like a terrible foundation for an intimate relationship. But it was fascinating because she had been, in the 2 or 3 years previous to us meeting, she had transitioned to a totally raw food diet, and it had taken quite a sustained period of time to make that transition. I think the only thing that I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying, the only exception to the raw food diet was the odd glass of champagne. But she was on a very strict raw food diet. I had found in the latter stages of my recovery journey, I'd been vegetarian for 3 years, thinking that was a kind of the right path for me. I'd then gone on a fairly high protein diet, and I'd found almost, in fact, it was one of those things that was a 5 or 10% almost fairly instant response by adding much more animal protein into my diet. And I'd seen that with some others, anecdotally, with some patients I'd worked on the psychology side. They would tell me they'd had a kind of similar experience. So she and I would just, it was just kind of ongoing. We would literally be emailing each other like long research articles, kind of arguing our kind of point and our position. And I remember once she was doing a talk at a raw food kind of group, and I remember standing up and just like not savaging her, because by this point we were on the same side, but just someone was telling someone with ME/CFS, you have to. I was just like, you're wrong, and it's just like so there was this kind of fighting of perspectives and opinions of really, and the kind of the phrase that we came up with in those days, and I'm sure it wasn't originating from us, but I must have heard it somewhere, was the idea of being a truth seeker, and the idea of not getting locked in positions because you're identified with a position, but being locked to the idea of always trying to find what is really true, and being willing to constantly question kind of core assumptions, even if that means that you've got this identity. You spent 3 years becoming raw food, and you feel like you're the kind of you're a much more spiritually awake human being because animals are not having to lose their lives for your nutrition, all that kind of thing. Right. To be willing to actually question that and challenge that. So that experience and a collection of experiences at that time really helped shape that willingness to challenge assumptions and to see things from different perspectives. But going back to your question about support groups, I think there was a place where I was clear that I only wanted to have a positive attitude towards what was happening. And that was important because I was surrounded by a lot of negativity around it and I didn't want more of that. But I also think that part of my difficulty with it was my own refusal to accept the circumstances that I was dealing with. So in many ways, and I don't think I ever really resolved this in the years that I was in. It was something that several number of years later I was able to look back on and kind of make sense of. But I don't think a part of me ever really fully accepted that I had a chronic illness. And one could argue there was a positive side to that because I was willing, therefore, to fight and determined to find a way out. But I would also argue that a place of acceptance would have allowed more of a calming of my nervous system and would have allowed more support and would have allowed me to, in certain situations, be more able to do things because I would have been more able to ask for the help and support that I needed. So I think that was also part of my resistance towards support groups, that quite honestly, I was just terrified of being surrounded by people that were dealing with what I was dealing with because I didn't want to face what I was dealing with. And I think these days my attitude is I've seen some MECFS support groups do a lot of good. I've seen them help people get access to good information. Some of the support groups in the early stages of Optimum Health Clinic actively facilitated people coming and seeing us. There was one group in North London used to subsidize people's sessions with us. Wow. So I've seen that side. I've seen support groups do amazing work in terms of advocating for people that are ill in terms of the needs that they have being met and be that around getting access to kind of funding that people need, or the kind of the whole ongoing battle we have at the moment around benefits that's going on. So I think they have their place. I think the key is you've got to choose the right group, and the groups need to do work around understanding and accepting that people are ill, but also maintaining this positive attitude towards recovery. And some groups can be extremely toxic in their attitude towards that. That's true of physical groups that you would attend in person. It's also true of online communities. There are some amazing online communities for recovery from MECFS. And there are forums out there, and I'm not going to name names, where I think one has about 20 pages of character assassination of me personally, most of which is completely inaccurate information.
Wow.
But it's like, there's just, you've got to find the right support. But I think support is important.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the reasons I was kind of curious about getting your thoughts on that is obviously because I guess although my experience is limited with those kind of forums and groups, a lot of what I have seen, I kind of view as, I've always been quite concerned with them because the ones I've seen are very toxic and there is a lot of negativity and all sorts going on there. But as you say, it's the same as any walk of life. You're going to get the good and the bad depending on where you're looking.
Yeah, and I think, look, community is really important. And when you're going through something which is an physically isolating and emotionally isolating experience, I think connecting with others that are sharing that experience is really important. And in the last 18 months or so of my recovery, I was in a relationship with someone who was also on the recovery path. And that was immensely helpful in lots and lots of ways. So I just think you have to choose carefully. And I think used rightly, used correctly, it's also a great way of accessing. A lot of people have discovered Optimum Health Clinic through online communities. People have talked about their positive experiences. So it's just you got to be cautious. And it's a bit like you go into a bar on a Friday night and there's a lot of different conversations going on, right? There's just people which are having a very heartfelt, deep and meaningful conversation about things in their life that are challenging, difficult. There are people which want to burn politicians, and there are people which want to fight, and there are people, you got to choose which conversation and which place you go to connect to people.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea around acceptance, I think, is huge as well. It's a conversation I have quite a lot with clients, and I think there's often this belief, I think, that if to accept means to give in, And obviously, I think part of it is just clarifying actually that that's not what we're saying. We can accept and still desire an improvement in our health. And there are the finer details there that sometimes just need to be talked through and reflected on. Because as you say, I think that acceptance, with that can come a greater level of self-compassion, which we know is a buffer to the stress response. And as you said, calm our nervous system, which I think is a huge thing when we're talking about this condition.
I think, you said it very eloquently. I think acceptance doesn't mean giving in, but it often feels like that when you first go to the place of acceptance. And somehow you have to take that leap to discover that on the other side of acceptance, you actually don't disintegrate and fall apart and lose the will to recover.
Right.
Because it's, there are people that have read my first book, and I actually, when the second edition came out, I deliberately wrote an extra section because I was concerned that I saw people that read it were starting to model my fighting attitude without recognizing that it was like it was, if I was doing it again, I wouldn't do it the way that I'd done it, if that makes sense. So yeah. I've noticed that again in some of the early patients that we work with, that I was inspiring them to take on that fighting attitude, and I was seeing that it wasn't helping them. And it was through that period over time I could reflect back and see. So there's a very deliberate attitude these days of correcting that. Yes, you need commitment, you need that fight, you need that will to recover, and you need to be willing to do sometimes the quite difficult things to facilitate that. But exactly as you say, you also have to surrender, and you have to accept that this is where you are right now, and if you fight it, you will be using stress, because to fight what's happening now requires resistance, and resistance requires some stress to fuel it, and that's not helpful.
No, absolutely. And actually what comes to mind there is what you mentioned around a degree of acceptance then can lead to asking for help in certain, let's say, situations, which probably is a nice little cue into the Optimum Health Clinic approach. Mm-hmm. So do you want to, for those of listeners who aren't really familiar with the Optimum Health Clinic, do you want to just give a little bit of background around the clinic and also the approach that you take?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So back in 2003, my book Why Me was published. And at that point, if I'm being really honest, I didn't have that much desire to work with people with any chronic fatigue, because I just spent 7 years dealing with it. So in a sense, it was like, I'll publish the book and then I'll go and I wanted to do more kind of life improvement, self-development kind of stuff. And then what started happening was, 4 out of 5 of people that read the book and contacted me had any chronic fatigue. And initially, I was probably a bit reluctant in my willingness to kind of to respond and engage. And then I think perhaps a bit more distance happened between my own recovery and where I was. And so I kind of perhaps worked through some of my own stuff around it. And I started to realize that I really did have something to offer those people. So this was early 2004, and this was around the time that Nikki Gretrick started working on nutrition side. And it was kind of extraordinary how it happened. I went out and did, I had this book, and in the first 3 months, no one was buying the book. So I was like, and it was before social media and all the things that people do these days. So I was like, I need to go and do talks about the book. So each week, initially I was just picking up the phone and phoning groups that have speakers, some ME support groups, some positive living groups and self-development groups. So for about a year or two, each week I would be somewhere different for a day, and I'd do an evening talk. And the Optimum Health Clinic just kind of built out of that, really. It was very organic. And within that first 6-9 months, we were booking out 3-4 months in advance. I then met Anna Dushinsky, who became the original director of psychology, and these days runs the practitioner training program on the psychology side that we have. And then we just started gradually bringing on more practitioners, and there was no great business plan. In fact, quite the opposite. I never had any experience at all in business, and so it was just, it ran out of. Nikki and I at that time, we were still together in a relationship. We had a little 2-bedroom flat in Highgate in North London, and we ended up. And again, back with a certain level of wisdom that wasn't there at the time. But I basically turned our two-bedroom flat into an office in most of the rooms, and we had a sofa bed that we pulled out at the night at bedtime to sleep in. Can't imagine why the relationship broke down. But we continued to work together for a number of years after that, and we're still good friends these days. Yeah, it just kind of grew organically out of that process. And fast forward kind of 14, 15 years, and we have now any one time about 1,000 patients in that we're working with in about 35, 40 countries around the world. About 5 years ago, I kind of reached the point that, I was still very involved in the psychology side, but I also unintentionally became an entrepreneur because I was having to build this organization, and it, it was getting bigger and bigger, and there was more people involved and more money involved and more complexity involved. And I made mistakes and learned things and kind of figured out that process. And I discovered that I enjoyed that process, and I enjoyed the kind of the growth that I got as a person through doing that. And I felt I wasn't growing in the way that I had done. I felt I'd got comfortable in my role. And I also felt that at this point, we published research in the British Medical Journal's British Journal Open around a kind of prospective preliminary study, which is basically like a pilot, effectively, of the approach that we had. We had some very positive findings from that. And I felt that for Optimum Health Clinic to really have the ultimate impact that I wanted it to have, I felt it would be better as a charity. So 5.5 years ago, I gifted over the assets of Optimum Health Clinic to a charity that I'd founded. And since then, 100% of any profit that has been generated, although profit isn't the primary motive in terms of how it's run, has been going into research, and that's been funding a randomized controlled trial that we've been spending, again, it's a long story, but an extremely complicated process to kind of set up and to put in place. So that's been a big part of the focus behind the scenes. So at this point, there are about 20 full-time practitioners that work in Optimum Health Clinic. There's a psychology department, a nutrition department. There's some kind of medical oversight in places as well. And we're very patient-led. Our approach has really just evolved. I can say it now because enough years have probably passed. But in the early years, I honestly look back and realize there were times we were just slinging mud at a wall to see what stuck. I mean, there were just times we didn't know what to do with people, and we would be transparent somewhat. I don't know what to do. I think this would be the thing to do. Let's try it. When you do that with thousands of patients in tens of thousands of consultations, you just start to see patterns. And a skill that, if I have a talent, I suppose one of those might be I'm good at seeing a big picture and seeing how things connect and seeing how things join up. And we've done a lot of mapping of different stages of the recovery process, different ways people are affected. And that map has become, I think, really the way we've been able to scale what we do to more than just a few practitioners. Because again, that was a big challenge of taking the knowledge of a few people and being able to replicate that to a standard of high quality. And in the early years of doing that, it wasn't always very effective. And so I think that map has been crucial in terms of being able to really see where different people are on the recovery process to figure out what things are more likely to be important at that point and to work collaboratively with them, and we consider patients have to be very active in the process. It's not a passive thing that you come along and you get told some things and that's it. In fact, part of our vetting process is we won't take on patients that we don't feel will be able to actively engage in the way that they need to.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. I was speaking to Pete Williams last week, who's a functional medicine practitioner in the UK, and he had a very similar point. This idea around he doesn't want to be and he shouldn't be working harder than the client to help the client work. And if that happens, then again, a conversation has to be had around that, I guess.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. And it's a tricky one sometimes because we very much live in a culture where medicine is a passive process, right? That you get sick, you go to the doctor, you get given a pill or a series of pills, or maybe you have to go and do a bit of physio for a period of time. But it's not a participatory process where, one of the ways that I talk about it is you need to be the captain of the ship of your own recovery. So you're not handing over responsibility to us or to a practitioner or to any practitioner that you're seeing. It's not that you need the captain of the ship doesn't necessarily know more about the engine room than the guy that runs the engine room, or know more about the kitchen than the person running the kitchen. In fact, the captain of the ship might be the worst cook on the ship and might be the worst at this and the worst at that. But they take the responsibility and they are making the decisions in terms of what things are given, what attention, at what point, and what way. And that is the only way that I see recovery working in a sustainable, effective way. Because a lot of the tricky things in recovery are not actually the big picture, like this is the protocol that you need to be on, or the maladaptive stress response, whatever it may be, is a key building block and you need to work on that. The challenges are the moment to moment in the day to day. Right now, should I rest or am I okay to do this activity? Or right now, what does my body need? Or am I expressing my needs or my feelings in the way that so there's all these very subtle, nuanced, moment to moment pieces. Practitioners aren't there in those moments. And I have a few times over the years been offered very large amounts of money to go and move in with people. And it's like, even that wouldn't work. Like, even if someone had, infinite resource and I or other practitioners were willing to literally go and be at the beck and call, it still wouldn't work, because the patient has to be the person that is making those moments, because only they have all of that information in their experience of what's happening, and they have to learn the language of how to interpret that and respond to that. And we can obviously, practitioners can help that process. They can almost give you the dictionary or the kind of translation book to interpret all of that. But the patient has to be responsible for the day-to-day, moment-to-moment execution of it.
Mm. Yeah, I think going to this idea of moving in with someone, while there may be some value there, it's, as you say, it's not getting to the underlying components of at least why some people can get ill. And that might be a little bit cryptic. So what I'm talking about there is, obviously there's research on personality traits being a predisposing factor within chronic fatigue. And if someone is just hiring someone to come in and cook and essentially help them with their life, then there's no growth and learning around, actually, what do I need to learn from this experience about how I'm operating in the world, so to speak.
Yeah, in fact, just a funny story just came to mind. The reason why, actually, when I have been asked to move in, I say no, is I did once do it many, many years ago. In fact, it was before Optimum Health Clinic even existed. It was in the first 6 months of being a therapist, when I wasn't really doing any CFS stuff. And it was someone that had suffering from anxiety and depression. And it, like a lot of my stories, it's a long story, but the short version of the story is that I moved in part-time for a period of time, and it was a complete and utter disaster. And you talked earlier about the practitioners never working harder than the client. So at one point we were we'd gone out for some fresh air. We were in a kid's playground, and I was trying to make this person laugh because I was trying to break the pattern of kind of negativity they were in. And so I was standing on one of those, you get in kids' playgrounds like a spring in the ground with like a seat on top.
Oh, yeah.
It's rock bouncing forwards. Well, standing on one of those, like pretending I was surfing, and saying, "Oh, what can I do to make you laugh?" And they were like, "Jump." So I kind of jumped up and I fell and I broke my arm.
Oh.
I was like, at that point, that night, lying there, sitting there in A&E at like 1 o'clock in the morning after the however many episodes of Sex and the City on silent, it's like what the hell am I doing in my life? Like, what's going on? And it was that kind of recognition. It's like, I wanted it more than they did, because at that point I was trying to prove myself as a therapist, and it was someone that was quite well known at the time. And it's like, you can't want it more than the client, and you can't do the work for them. And actually, the patients that make the best progress tend to be the ones where they take much more leadership and responsibility for it. And they're almost coming to sessions with bringing up their own insights. And as a practitioner, you're just steering it once you've got things moving, you're just kind of helping steer it and providing reflection. You're not constantly feeling like you're having this massive kind of push to get things progressing forwards.
Yeah, that's such a well put point. And I always think, looking back with my clients, that while it goes one of two ways, the clients that I don't hear much from in between sessions are either the ones who are most successful or least successful, and they just haven't done anything. But as I would say, over 80% of the time, it's the former. It's they are just getting on with things. They're doing their reflection. They're aware of challenges that are coming up, and they're able to work through some of that on their own. And then we obviously discuss some of the, let's just say, the more complex components of what they're struggling with.
Yes.
So yeah, I think that's a really key point.
I think there is a place. Sometimes clients will need education of how the relationship needs to work, and it's a little bit like, I mentioned I had this conversation with my uncle a few years into being ill, and he was like, look, actually, if you want the circumstances to change, you're going to have to be proactive in the process. So, we put out, we have a online video platform, about 100 hours of recovery, going back to solving the problem that when I was ill, I didn't feel there was recovery stories. We've got 100 hours of interviews of recovered patients and teaching videos with practitioners and stuff. And the first module on there is called Coaching Yourself for Recovery. So it's actively training people to become their own coach, not that they're going to necessarily figure out all the things they need to figure out. They're not going to become the practitioner, but they're going to become proactive in that relationship. And sometimes people just need some understanding that, hang on, this is not like when you go and see your GP and they're almighty and powerful, and you're kind of sat there kind of like, please find the answer to my health woe. That there's that very active participation in the process. I think that's what you're speaking to.
Yeah, definitely. And it actually just really resonates with a recent conversation, again, with Pete Williams, where he was saying the same kind of thing, basically. And his particular point was more around, which is very similar, setting the right expectations at the beginning of that journey together. So there is that understanding of, okay, this is an active process. It isn't a passive one like conventional medicine to a degree is.
But it's also, it's interesting, actually, just if you don't mind me just jumping off another moment on that. I think what I also see is this piece can also swing too far the other way. So one of the things that you will see is with certain approaches that if either explicitly stated sometimes, but often at least implicitly stated, that if this thing doesn't work for you, it's because you haven't applied it the right way. And that also can become dangerous, because it's, if seeing a practitioner on a particular path doesn't work, people are going to blame one of three things. They're going to blame the practitioner, they're going to blame the method, or they're going to blame themselves. And I would much rather that the client blame me as the practitioner than blame the method if the method potentially has got some merit for that person at that time. And I certainly don't want them blaming themselves, because one of the things that you see is people going down certain paths, and because all they talk about is the miracle recovery stories, they feel like, I'm the only person that went and did this thing that didn't recover, and therefore it must be my fault. And now they're worse off than they were at the start, because before they had this illness and they had this struggle. Now they've got this illness and struggle, but now it's also their fault because they were the only one that didn't effectively apply this thing that they learned. So it's a kind of, for practitioners, I think there's a sensitivity around making the client responsible, i.e. response able, the ability to respond to what's happening, without that sliding into a place of inner critic and self-blame. And for patients, or for people that are struggling with health conditions, never get into the place that you think it's your fault, even if you recognize, and again, I think something you touched on earlier, but even if you recognize that if you want the circumstances to change, you may have to be the one to lead the change. It doesn't make it your fault, and it doesn't mean that the situation you're in is something you need to blame yourself for, because that's never constructive and never helpful.
Yeah, and then having that relationship with the practitioner where they can ask for that help at that point in time is going to be really important as well. So yeah, I guess another example whereby balance within these ideas and concepts is key. I'm kind of mindful of time, Alex, and I would love to get your thoughts on the Optimal Health Clinic actual approach. So I think I'm right in saying that you have this idea around there are 7 subtypes and sort of the 3 stages from a recovery perspective. So would you mind just, I guess, expanding on these concepts a little bit more?